So next we've got up Shaun Flores, who will be doing a talk on OCD. So Shaun uses his lived experience to share his story through TEDx talks, working with businesses, schools and universities to have conversations that often get avoided. So things around like mental health, masculinity, race, identity, neurodiversity and resilience. And just from a personal point of view, I've been chewing his ear off this morning and he is an interesting guy. So Shaun.
So good. Oh, it's good afternoon. We're at a perfect time. So yes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit all about OCD, and you're probably wondering, what does OCD have to do with anything to do with neurodiversity? And quite often, it's because there is a massive overlap with autism and ADHD and other neurodiversities that actually quite often OCD has actually been left out of the conversation. And as you can see from the video here, I do like to use visual imagery. I think visual imagery is incredibly important and is incredibly powerful. As human beings, we are fundamentally storytelling creatures. And I think one of the best ways to relay information is actually to be able to tell you a story. So this is from a TEDx talk that I delivered last year all about OCD. So before I go any further, I think it's the green button. Is this one? Is it this one I'm using? Is it, which one am I going? Yes. So I've had an opportunity to work with some fantastic organizations. I've developed peer support projects on wards all around mental health, especially in particular to do with OCD. But I was working on my book and the publishing house closed down out of nowhere. So we're going to have to rechange that at some point. But just to give you a context and a trigger warning, I am someone who's quite open and I'm quite honest. So if at any point it's too much, please step out. And I think in particular with the topic surrounding OCD, it's a very much needed conversation. But before I go anywhere, I like to warm people up in a room. So I'm going to put some characters up on the screen. And I want to see how in touch your brain is at this current moment in time with neurodiversity. Are we ready? Sensational. Does anyone know who this is? What does Tigger represent from a neurodiverse perspective? What type of ADHD? Absolutely correct. Who's this? What does he represent from a neurodiverse perspective? No. What would Winnie, so Winnie the Pooh actually represents one mental health condition in particular and another neurodiversity. No. So technically, what's Winnie the Pooh always doing? Which would be what? It would be binge eating, technically. Also, Winnie the Pooh is always inattentive. So you actually, some people would say represents inattentive ADHD. So what do we think Po from Kung Fu Panda represents? Potentially dyspraxia, potentially. But it's actually really interesting. In all three movies, Po only reacts to stress. Po's potential is only activated at the hardest moments in time. And some people would say it's a classic ADHD trait where you have the pressure is what makes Po actually rise to the occasion. Do we know who this is? And what would Sonic represent from a neurodivergent perspective? Yes, hyperactive ADHD. I like the fact it's R. Okay. Who is this? And what would they represent? Correct. We're finally getting there. And who is this? What would Deadpool represent? So ADHD would be one of them, but there's something else Deadpool does represent. Correct, absolutely. Autism. So if you look at how Deadpool's represented in movies, his outer monologue, he's always outer processing constantly. He doesn't understand social cues in no way, shape, or form. Says the things you're not supposed to say. Who's this? And what would Genie represent? Correct, it would represent ADHD. Absolutely, Eeyore would represent depression, and this one. Absolutely. So I like to use this here as a commonality to actually show that the media does represent mental health or neurodiversity in particular ways, but we actually overlook it. But on the other side, media presents particular neurodivergencies or particular mental health conditions in an absolutely stereotypical way. And as I said, I think as storytelling creatures is a great way to get people to remember. But I would say at this current moment in time, did anyone see what happened at the Brits? And I think the BRICS controversy was a great example of how we're not ready to have particular conversations around neurodivergency and also not to have particular conversations around mental health conditions. So the two actors went up on stage, somebody with Tourette's, and they were there to promote a film called I Swear, used a racial slur, and it became a lot more about politics and the media rather than it was the focus on the film. And I often would say, as an analogy, it's not the exact same, but OCD presents quite often similarly to how Tourette's is. Involuntary, intrusive thoughts that happen over and over again. But I would actually claim also this was a watershed moment to have better conversations around neurodiversity, but also mental health conversations. So what has shaped some of our attitudes on mental health? Most importantly, we've got the media, we've got culture, and we've got religion. And I would actually say the media has become one of the most important institutions to challenge discrimination, to challenge bias, but also to change the way we actually understand neurodiversity and mental health. But also on the other side of that, there's the idea that neurodiversity and mental health is social contagion. In many ways, it's seen as a new cool identity. And the media has either a really positive part to play in it or a very negative. In some cultures, they don't have particular words or understanding around what it means to be neurodiverse or to have mental health conditions. And religion is also another really important institution that can either be a barrier and it can also continue to be a great hindrance. So pop culture has had a massive impact on what we understand OCD to be. Obsessive Compulsive Periods in 2013 was aired, and several seasons later, we still understand OCD to only be about cleaning and symmetry, and we still only believe OCD is something to be desired. It's a character trait, it's a quirk, but I think for most of the people living with it, they would make the argument it's completely not the same. We also have Grey's Anatomy, where someone was presented with OCD. Does anyone know who the person is on the bottom right? Also, another character, quite quirky, quite strange. The media presents OCD in a particular kind of way beyond the conventional narrative. There's other types of OCD that people don't speak about. And Monk is another show where OCD is presented in a particular kind of way. But we have to define what OCD is. And OCD is a disorder of obsessions and compulsions where the mind gets stuck on threat, doubt, or uncertainty, and the person feels driven to do something to neutralize it. How many people here have intrusive thoughts? I often say for as long as you have a brain, you will have intrusive thoughts. So what I like to do with people to show again that it's very common, I'm going to say 3 statements to see how common these intrusive thoughts are. Are we ready? The first one is, how many people here have had a thought about fly kicking a child? That's quite irritating. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a bit harsh, but yeah. How many people here have had thoughts about punching an old person when they're taking too long to walk? For sure. I'm not saying I agree with it. We're not here to debate if we agree or disagree. How many people here have had thoughts or images in their heads? It's very common to actually have images in your heads and these random intrusive thoughts as a result of OCD. But there's types of obsessions that actually come with OCD that we don't talk about. As I said, we talk about how cleaning and symmetry present, but there's other ways. You've got harm OCD, you've got existential, you've got relationship, real event, and moral. There's actually another type of OCD that I think the world isn't ready for. Pedophilia OCD, which is the obsession and the fear that somebody is a pedophile. These are not Hollywood clean versions or ways that we can talk about OCD. And what sadly happens as a result of this, quite often a lot of people with OCD, on top of the shame of having it and being neurodivergent, will never come forward. And old studies have actually shown that from the onset of symptoms to be able to get a diagnosis, it takes people on average about 14 to 17 years to be diagnosed. And it's because of the shame and the stigma, but also the fear you end up in a mental health institution, people will not understand, and so much more. So these are other types of themes. There's several types of themes. Your brain can gridlock onto whatever it is, whatever your anxieties, whatever your fears are, whatever your beliefs, your brain can plague you over and over again. So I'm going to explain just a tiny bit about that cycle. It starts off with an intrusive thought, which we all have. Some of you can laugh about, some of you can dismiss it. But what people typically do is they have a behavior or a compulsion to alleviate the anxiety that comes as a result of that intrusive thought. but they get temporary relief. You're not teaching your brain that it's something for you to not worry about. And we know in particular for individuals who are neurodivergent, their nervous system / their brain is quite hypersensitive. So the things within the body, they will continue to feel that's even more real. So some of the biggest OCD myths that we have are we're all a little bit OCD. And we probably all see this on TikTok and Instagram. You are not all a little bit OCD. That's just simply not how it works. And it's really important to address some of these common misconceptions. OCD is only about symmetry and cleaning. I've addressed that it's not. Thoughts make us who we are. Descartes, a philosopher, once said, I believe it's as a man thinketh, so is he. And I often say that's not necessarily the case. Your brain is a random machine. It creates these random, very strange thoughts. But these thoughts in society, we still think are deeply tied to our identities. But having certain thoughts mean you will act on them. And the research has actually shown for individuals that have OCD on top of other neurodivergencies that they are the least likely to act on the thoughts. It's the fact that the brain will play them is what terrifies them the most, to simply have the presence of the thought. But OCD is rare. OCD is not rare. They predict at this current moment in time in the UK that up to 750,000 to 1 million people have OCD. But that is the diagnosed population. We strongly believe that there's far more people out there that have OCD that will never, ever speak about it. OCD is a neurodiversity. Well, some people would say it's not, and I would say it's not either. I would make the claim that to have a neurodiversity, there's almost like a trade-off. There's some things you're incredibly brilliant at, and other things you're maybe not so brilliant at, the spiky profile. But OCD is not a neurodiversity, but often it gets lumped in. It's a mental health condition that we are often seeing incredibly present in other neurodiversities. So, as I said, older sources said that it could take 14 to 17 years for someone with OCD to get the appropriate treatment. But more recent studies show that the average delay to diagnosis has now become shorter, but it's still too long. So it's often now about 7 to 8.5 years, depending on the sample. So you've got the barriers such as culture. In particular, in some cultures, if you're from a more religious community, you're more likely to have certain themes that come as a result of OCD, whether that's religion and so much more. So it's really important to understand we need a lot more research actually around OCD and how it interacts with those, in particular in the neurodiverse community. But how is it? We still don't understand OCD, but here are some of the headlines that you will see within the media. And for some people, you can see some of the faces it's quite harrowing. These are some of the titles that you will see. But we still do not understand what OCD actually is. And I think that is quite strange. This is a time where we're having conversation around autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergencies. But one of the mental health conditions that we're commonly seeing present, we're still not having conversations. So, because I have a short amount of time, I want to keep it really short. It's a whistle-stop tour. I want us to have some very clear takeaways. That OCD does belong in a neurodiverse conversation simply because it can sometimes come across quite identical to autism and ADHD. But a crossover comorbidity, I'm not a fan of the word comorbidity, and misidentification are very common. We need better research, actually, and better treatment for those who are neurodivergent, in particular with OCD symptoms, but we need better awareness. And why I say we need better treatment is because a lot of people are actually quite resistant to the treatment. And we know that typical CBT doesn't work for those typically that are neurodivergent. We need it to actually become adapted for those individuals. So if you know somebody that may be struggling with OCD, or you yourself may suspect you have OCD, here are some charities that I do work with that I highly do recommend. They have peer support groups. The research is becoming a lot more conclusive as well. And another really random fact actually is, in the NHS, there was a cost of illness analysis done for OCD back in 2023 by the University of Hertfordshire. And they predicted that OCD cost the NHS about 378 million a year. So we still don't understand how, in spite of the economic costs, the physical, the mental, and the emotional cost to people's lives, we still don't have a great understanding of it, in particular in society, but also within the neurodiverse community. So I want to say thank you so much for giving me the time. If you want to see more of my work, please check it out, and I am more than happy to take any questions from anybody. How long do I have left?
Hi, Shaun. Thanks for that. My name's Simone. I'm from PSS UK, which is Passion Shape Support. I would just like you to say, if you could give 3 top tips as an employer, how best you can support someone in your team with OCD.
That's a really good question, actually, and reasonable adjustments, I think, really do matter here. I think one of the first things I often do say to organizations is actually to have an understanding of how it presents for that particular individual, because it can be any particular type of theme, understanding maybe what goes on in their treatment plan. Another really big thing that I think has really helped when I do work with organizations is having lived experience talks, so people know that they're not alone actually with it. It's really, really important. It's one of those illnesses or those mental health conditions that it feels incredibly special and incredibly negative to have. But as I said, we all have those intrusive thoughts. Just for some of us, it plagues us more than others. The awareness, the education within the wider team, I think is also going to be incredibly important. Having the right language to understand that you're not all a particular type of OCD. It's just not how the brain works. But within those reasonable adjustments, having the realization that typically the way that you treat OCD is through like exposure hierarchies. You expose somebody to their particular obsession, their brain keeps responding in a particular kind of way. So having an understanding of where they are within their journey is also really, really important. And understanding sometimes people need safe spaces, brave spaces, depends on what you call it. But having time away from a team, maybe home working, could also actually be really, really relevant for some people. So those are some of the things that I could say. I can have a conversation with you more, but those are, I think I said 4. You said 3. But those are some of the 3 that I would, for the 4, that I would say at this current moment in time that I found works really, really well. But the team has to have an understanding of what it actually is before they go and try and help those individuals.
So the question is, what do you think about OCD being labelled as acquired neurodiversity? That refers to changes in cognition and behaviours in your lifetime.
In my personal opinion, and from the research I've seen, we would say no, it's not a neurodiversity. A lot of the work that we do, and as I said, I would qualify neurodiversity as a trade-off, in my opinion. Depends on how you see it. The brain fires differently, but you still have some sort of benefits that come as a result of the neurodivergency. I wouldn't say that there's necessarily positives that come with OCD. You're far more likely to take your own life because of the type of thoughts that you're having. And I don't think it's something people would desire to want. If you live in the mind of someone that struggles with OCD, which I've deeply struggled with in the past, and I'm really at a completely different point, I would say I don't believe it's acquired neurodiversity. However, I think for the sake of having wider conversations, I can understand the benefits to bringing it into calling it acquired neurodiversity.
So the next one was, are phobias a type of OCD?
Phobias can be presented to some sort of degree. Emetophobia is a good example. To some sort of degree, they can cross over with OCD. I think the difference is with OCD, it's crippling, repetitive, intrusive, unwanted thoughts over and over again. And I think what we're starting to see from what I can remember is if a lot of phobias in OCD, OCD is no longer classed as an anxiety disorder. It's now classed as an obsessive compulsive disorder within its own right. So from what I can understand, they can often overlap. So to some degree, it can be a phobia. So yeah, to some degree, but I would say again, it can be quite different. Thank you so much.